This lecture focuses a little bit more on the philosophical problem or the epistemological problem of skepticism. Skepticism in general is a philosophical position that claims that we lack knowledge. This view is usually contrasted with the view that we do have some kind of knowledge or some knowledge, which is the classical view in epistemology that knowledge is possible and that some people have it. Skepticism as a kind of philosophical understanding or theory in epistemology is actually rather widespread. And this is because some versions of skepticism are quite plausible while others are not. Skeptics, the people that believe in skepticism and hold to skeptical views and arguments, construct arguments that try to show that people that think that they have knowledge actually have less knowledge than they might otherwise think. Now, there are lots of different kinds of skepticism. The first that's worth kind of getting out there is the most extreme. And this view is called global skepticism. On this view, the idea is that in some way, shape, or form, no one really knows anything. And this view is sometimes accompanied with another view that says something like that knowledge itself is impossible. On this view, the idea would be that because knowledge is not possible, no one actually knows anything. Now, this view is rather implausible because it seems like whatever we mean when we talk about people knowing things, at the very least, people do seem to know some really basic things. Even if they don't know sort of highfalutin philosophical or scientific facts. It does seem like, I know what I'm looking at right now, that I'm looking at a computer, that I'm talking this moment. Global skepticism then as an extreme view, isn't so plausible. But there are forms of more global-ish skepticisms that are larger or more widespread that are more plausible. Limited skepticism is a more complicated and plausible form of skepticism, generally associated with skepticism in different sort of subjects or subgenres of where we might know things. There's a range of plausibility here between different kinds of skepticism. So, for example, there's vaccine skepticism, where people like anti-vaxxers are skeptical about the efficacy of vaccines or whether or not they're safe. Conservatives are often skeptical about the effects that humans are having on climate change. Flat earthers are skeptical about the sphericality of the planet. And then scientists are, skeptical of things like the existence of ghosts or spirits. Some of these are clearly more plausible than others, but they're all a form of skepticism, where the idea is that some group of people that think that they have a certain kind of knowledge, the argument is against that kind of knowledge, claiming, no, there are these reasons that we have for thinking that that knowledge isn't as up to stuff. Skepticism in science is common, but not terribly feared, I guess I would say. Skepticism in science is just kind of part of the territory. Lots of people are skeptical about very specific claims, and you have to back up your experiments and your views in order to get anything published in science at all. Skepticism within philosophy is a much bigger problem. First of all, it's very unclear in philosophy whether or not we are ever able to really know anything with certainty, any philosophical truths with certainty. And then skepticism as its own kind of subject rears its head. And basically we end up with certain kinds of skepticism that are very difficult to deal with, like skepticism about knowing the future, skepticism about knowing whether or not we can ever have no truths of ethics, and skepticism about whether or not the external world even exists. It's first helpful to sort of distinguish different levels of skeptical doubt. Different kinds of skeptics might have different kinds of views about what's going on in particular subjects or subfields. One level, the sort of most extreme level of skeptical doubt, is the claim that knowledge is somehow impossible. Um, in a global context, this would mean that no one ever knows anything or no one ever could. But you might imagine a more localized context, a sort of more specialized form of skepticism, where you might think that knowledge is impossible in that particular subfield. So a maybe more plausible view would be that knowledge is not possible in the realm of astrology, because astrology doesn't actually track anything that one could possibly know about. A second view is that knowledge is sort of possible, but it's not really currently available to anyone. The idea here would be something like maybe a form of skepticism in an early kind of science, right? So think about like ancient Greek people trying to determine anything about physics. They thought that, there was air, wind, water, and fire, but they didn't know about electrons and protons and atoms and things like that. In this case, knowledge ultimately was possible, but they didn't have the tools to sort of get at it. And so they weren't currently able to achieve it. The same thing could possibly go for lots of things, even today. There might be certain kinds of realms where skepticism is currently justified because while the knowledge is out there to be, achieved, no one is currently able to achieve it. Finally, there's the third level of skeptical doubt where the knowledge is out there and is possible and someone could achieve it, but simply no one has actually currently latched onto it. Imagine here maybe a scientist that is running experiments, and the experiments will eventually give us correct data and knowledge, but currently haven't, right? It seems that the knowledge is there, it's ready to be discovered, but it hasn't currently been discovered. In this kind of case, at least with a scientist, it is good for a scientist to be skeptical of their own data, just to make sure that they can, check everything, double check everything, and be sure before they actually try and publish something. When it comes to thinking about epistemological skepticism, it's helpful to distinguish it from a few different theories or different kinds of skepticism. Now, there's lots of different kinds of more everyday skepticism, like being skeptical about whether or not there's life on other planets, or being skeptical in mathematics about whether or not certain conjectures will ever be proven. But these really just aren't forms of epistemological skepticism because they're focusing on particular subject matters, particular areas of knowledge. Similarly, there's a kind of almost skepticism, almost epistemological skepticism that's available in philosophy, where, say, someone thinks that ultimately ethical knowledge isn't available because what we take ourselves to know in ethics is simply the recognition of other people's preferences or other cultures' preferences. In this kind of view, a form of relativism about ethics, there might not be available knowledge of objective truths, but this is not exactly epistemological skepticism. True epistemological skepticism is the view that there's a sort of domain of facts within a particular subject matter, and that no one knows those facts, either because it's hard for us to get at them, to know them, or for someone to know them, and haven't succeeded yet at getting at them, or because it's simply impossible to know those facts. The facts exist, but it's not possible to know them. Let's look at a few examples. Take the number of hairs on Jesus' head when he was crucified. Now, this is, of course, a ridiculous case, but hopefully you get the point. This is something that it seems like it was possible to know, but no one was there to count all of the hairs on Jesus' head when he died. In fact, no one counts the hairs on your head currently, or my head, and it's just an absurd thing to try and do. It seems like there's a fact of the matter about the number of hairs that are had on someone's head. However, we're justified in being skeptical in this kind of case because it's simply not something that anyone has the time, effort, or need to know. But something a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more interesting when it comes to thinking about epistemological skepticism is issues about things like whether or not there's an afterlife. So if there's a fact of the matter about whether or not there's an afterlife, but no one seems to know whether or not there's an afterlife. And then there's a good question whether or not it's possible to know whether or not there's an afterlife. I mean, if God exists, then he probably knows, but we're talking here about human beings. Even if someone was given, say, a dream or a vision that, that there was an afterlife, would we really say that they know that there's an afterlife or not? Similarly, questions about whether or not God exists. It seems that there must be a fact of the matter that either God does exist or he doesn't. And many people believe that he does exist, and many people believe that he doesn't. But do any of these people that have these beliefs really know? There are a number of different kinds of arguments for skepticism, and here we'll be going through a few. Just to sort of lay out some preliminaries, again, we've discussed this before, but when we're talking about arguments in this class, when we want valid, what are called valid arguments. If an argument is a good argument, it's going to be valid. And a valid argument is the kind of argument that has a particular logical property. That means that the sentences in the argument are connected to one another in a very special way. The premises are related. And this is ultimately what it means. An argument is valid if, assuming that the premises are true, the conclusion follows as well, must also be true. So on the basis of thinking that, a valid argument is related between the premises and the conclusion. The premises are so interconnected to the conclusion that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. That doesn't mean that the premises are true. A sound argument is ultimately an argument where the premises are true as well, but a valid argument is the more important kind of argument that we're looking at here. When we're looking at valid arguments, if you have a valid argument before you, and you dislike the conclusion, you disagree with the conclusion, you think, no, the conclusion must be false. Well, if the argument is valid, and that's basically all of the kinds of arguments that we're talking about in this class, if the argument is valid and the conclusion you think is false, then because the way that the argument is set up, that's such that the conclusion is connected really closely to the premises, you can't simply disagree with the conclusion without trying to figure out how to disagree with one of the premises. Valid arguments, they can have false conclusions, but they can only have false conclusions given the falsity of one of the premises. Here's an example, a rather dumb example. If Neil Armstrong were to be a cow, then it would be true that a cow has been in space. Premise 2, Neil Armstrong is a cow. Conclusion, so a cow has been in space. Now, this argument is valid. If the first and second premises were true, then the conclusion would follow necessarily and be true as well. However, this argument is not sound. It's a bad argument, but not because it's invalid. The argument is valid, but one of the premises itself is false, leading to the falseness of the conclusion. Neil Armstrong is not a cow. He was a human being. Now we can look at some arguments for skepticism. Descartes originally put forward the argument from the possibility of error. He claimed that for any belief, if it could be mistaken, then ultimately it's not a case of knowledge. Descartes wanted to set knowledge on firm foundations, and so for all of his beliefs, he basically went through his thinking and wanted to pick out all of the beliefs that he thought might be incorrect. So ultimately, he kicked out all of the beliefs about what he was seeing right now, what he was feeling, anything that he thought he could possibly be mistaken about, like so that he had a body. He even thought that was possibly mistaken. What he couldn't be mistaken about was that he existed, right? Was that he was a thinking thing. Um, but so the idea here on this argument is to kick out all of the beliefs that you could possibly be mistaken about. And if there's something that you could possibly be mistaken about, then it can't count as knowledge. So for any belief, if it could be mistaken, then it can't count as knowledge. All beliefs about some subject matter could be mistaken. Now here you have to give some kind of more plausible reasoning, but on Descartes' view, like his beliefs about the external world, he thought, well, maybe I could be dreaming right now, and then my beliefs about the external world would be wrong. Or he thought maybe that an evil demon has fooled me about all of my thinking about mathematics, and so maybe I could be wrong. Therefore, all of the beliefs about that subject matter are not cases of knowledge. This follows from premise 1 here, premise 2 here, and the conclusion. Ultimately, this would lead to a kind of skepticism about whatever the particular subject matter is that's been placed in the blanks. Here's an everyday sort of example thinking about the possibility of error case. Suppose that I need to deposit a check on a Friday, and it's very important that I do so, that I get the check in so that money doesn't bounce out of my account or something like that. And I ask my wife, when does the bank close? She responds, 5 o'clock. Well, I saw the hours posted on the door last week. I might return to her and ask, well, wait a minute, might the hours have changed or be different on Fridays? This ultimately is going to raise the possibility that she might be in error. On this view, if this argument is acceptable, the possibility that she is in error would lead to us thinking that she doesn't know. Now, if this argument is good, then it should show that she really doesn't know that the bank is open until 5. But if this argument is bad, then maybe this situation isn't, maybe she does really know. I'll leave that to you for you to decide and think about. The certainty argument is another argument for skepticism, and it depends on the claim that knowledge and certainty are very, very tightly related. On the certainty argument, the claim is, the sort of underlying principle, is that if someone S knows some proposition P, then that person S must be certain that P is true, certain about P. And the idea here is that given that principle and the idea that no one is ever certain about any particular proposition that they know, then for any proposition like that, it's going to ultimately be the case that the person S does not know that P. Here again, we can think about the bank case. If I ask my wife when the bank closes and she says that she saw the hours posted on the door last week, if I ask her whether or not she's certain, and she's not, there's a good question. If you are certain, do you really know whether or not the bank is open until 5? Here, we might think that we should plausibly be skeptical about the situation, about her knowledge, simply on the basis of the fact that she's not certain. What should we think about these arguments? Are they any good? Here's another version of each of them. Suppose that I park my car in the parking lot and then walk to my office. Once I'm in my office, I, of course, can no longer see my car. I still have the belief, once I'm in my office, that my car is in the parking lot right where I left it. Now, here's the argument. If my belief about my car could be mistaken, then it cannot be knowledge. Well, suppose that my car has been stolen or towed since I left it in the lot. Well, in that case, my belief that my car is left where I left it in the lot would be mistaken. So my belief, of course, could be mistaken. So given this argument structure and argument form, what the conclusion would follow is that my belief is not knowledge. Now, if you think that that's plausible, then you buy this argument. But if you think that ultimately I should know where my car is, given that it's still in the lot, even though it's possible that it has been stolen or towed, then you need to pick one of these premises to deny. You could try and deny that my belief could be mistaken. That would be rather difficult to deny because it seems like my belief really can be mistaken in this case. Or you can deny the principle that merely on the basis of the belief being mistaken, that it cannot be knowledge. The same thing goes for the certainty argument. Given the same situation, according to the certainty argument, if I'm not certain about where my car is, then I do not know where my car is. I'm of course not certain of where my car is. I'm unable to see it. I haven't looked at it in the last 5 minutes or whatever. And so given the certainty argument, on the basis of the principle that certainty is required for knowledge, then I would not know where my car is because I'd lack certainty. If you think that this argument is plausible, then it goes through. If you think that it's implausible, you need to decide which of the two premises must be denied. Is it the case that I'm not certain about where my car is? Or do you want to deny the initial principle that certainty is required for knowledge? Finally, we get to the most interesting and elaborate argument for skepticism. And this one basically functions along the lines of a matrix-like scenario, using what we call the brain in the vat argument, or the brain in the vat hypothesis. Now, suppose that you could be a handless brain in a vat. That is, you could be someone who, one day you're alive, and then at night a evil scientist comes in, knocks you out. I mean, you're asleep already, keeps you asleep, removes your brain from your head, places you in a vat, plugs in a bunch of electrodes to your brain to continue to feed a computer simulation that looks exactly like the real world does right now to you. Now, this, of course, maybe isn't possible at the moment, but it seems like the kind of thing, at least science fiction possible, in the near future. Now, take the brain in the vat hypothesis as the statement that you could be a brainless hand in a vat that's hooked up to this computer, and then take the other statement, the statement OB, obvious belief, the statement that you have hands. These two statements are in conflict. If one is true, that you are a handless brain in a vat, then it's not true that you have hands. And if it's true that you have hands, then you are not a handless brain in a vat. The argument goes that ultimately no one knows that the brain in a vat hypothesis is false, at least about themselves. The thought here being that because everything would be exactly as it seems to you now, were you to be someone that had been, taken by an evil scientist, or maybe a bunch of like sentient robots, if you're a fan of the Matrix, and placed into one of these situations, no one can possibly know that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. It's just a possibility. It's an out there possibility, but it's a possibility, and it seems like you can't know for sure that it's not true. Premise 2. Because no one knows, that means that you don't know. S, whoever S is, right? So S doesn't know that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. And if and then from there we get, because given previously we knew that OB and BIV are in conflict with one another, if S knows that OB is true, and then S knows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false, right? This given the idea that ultimately if you have the obvious belief, or if it's true that you have hands,
then it can't be true that you are a handless brain in a vat. So if you know that the one is true, the first one, that you have hands, then you know that you're not a handless brain in a vat. It just follows from the fact that you know you have hands, because it's not possible to have hands and be a handless brain in a vat. So because we said in premise 2 that S doesn't know that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false, then it must be the case that S doesn't know that that they have hands, that OB is true. This argument is valid, but it's a form of what's called Modus-Tollin style argument, which we haven't looked as many of so far. Modus-Tollin style arguments start off with a premise that says not Q connected to an if P then Q premise. Here, so you go if P then Q, not Q, so not P. Here, basically what's going on is the first premise is just going from a general case to a specific case, right, from the first to the second premise. No one knows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false, and if that's true, which seems plausible on its own, because how could anyone possibly know that it's false? Well, that seems to support 2. So if no one knows, then any particular individual couldn't possibly know that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. So that's your not Q part. Then premise 3 is an if P then Q, right? If S knows that the obvious belief that they have hands is true, then S knows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. That's just your basic if P then Q. And that just connects the idea that knowing that you have hands means that you know that you're not a handless brain in the vat. However, given that we have not Q already, we get to sort of do this Modus-Tollin's inference and derive not P. So S doesn't know that the obvious belief that S has hands is true. So are you convinced by this argument? It does seem rather plausible to think that it's very difficult to know that you're not a brain in a vat right now. How could you? It would seem exactly the same. However, given that you can't know that you're not a handless brain in a vat right now, it seems like you also just can't know that you have hands, and that seems problematic. Luckily, there are a number of ways to respond to different forms of skepticism. We're going to look at 3 here now. 1, that skepticism is itself self-undermining. 2, what's called the Morean response to skepticism. And the third view is what is called fallibilism. The first response to skepticism that you might have thought of is to claim that skepticism itself is self-undermining. Now, the original form of skepticism that we were thinking about, this sort of global skepticism, is somewhat implausible, because it seems like the skeptic is claiming that no one can know anything. But if the skeptic is claiming that no one knows anything, how could they possibly know that no one knows anything? Of course, here the skeptic can always hedge and claim that they don't really know that no one knows anything, but that they can sort of set a standard and say, look, no one has proven that they know anything. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, no one has shown, with certainty that they know anything about the external world or whatever. And as long as this form of hedging is possible, it seems that a skeptic can escape the claim that skepticism is ultimately self-undermining. The problem here, though, is whether or not the skeptic is sort of justified in claiming such a high standard. Is putting such a high standard on knowledge really plausible? A famous philosopher named G.E. Moore responded to skepticism in a little bit of a different way. Think about the brain in the vat hypothesis and the claim, OB, that you have hands. Moore got up in front of a bunch of his peers and responded to skepticism in this way. He pointed at his hand. He said, "This is a hand, and I know this is a hand." And then he said, well, if this is a hand, and I know that this is a hand, then the external world exists because this is an object in the external world. And that means that skepticism is false, that there is knowledge of an external world. So he thinks that the external world exists, and he knows that the external world exists. More's claim, well, rather sort of strange, is to basically say that the phrase, this is a hand, his holding up his hand and pointing at his hand, is ultimately more plausible than the brain in the vat hypothesis. It's something that he's more certain of, more sure of. And when you think about it, you have to hold these two things before your mind at the same time. Think about your belief in your hands, and then think about your belief that ultimately no one knows that they might not be in the matrix scenario right now. Which of those two things is more plausible to you? If you were to hold them equally, does one seem like it just jumps out at you more as more plausible than the other? More's idea is that surely that you have hands is more straightforward and more plausible than the thought that you don't know that you are not a handless brain in a vat. Now, this, of course, is a little unsatisfying because it doesn't really ultimately answer the skeptic, but it kind of pushes the skeptic. What it does is instead of accepting the skeptic's very high standard for knowing, it rejects their starting point and says, no, look, my standard is down here with my hand right in front of me. I see my hands in front of me, and so I believe them, that they are real, and I believe that they're out there in the external world, and if I'm right, then I know that I have hands. And if I know that I have hands, then I know that there's something in the external world, and so the external world exists. Basically, More's strategy here is to not give the skeptics an inch, to not allow them to set the standards for the debate. In a way, we can ask them why it's plausible to believe their claims that they should set the standards so high, and we can then see if those reasons apply equally as well to our standards where we have set them with respect to believing that in our own hands. Finally, and probably the most well-received response to skepticism to date is the view that we call fallibilism. Fallibilism is the idea that ultimately we must reject that the mere possibility of error and lack of certainty are required for knowing in the first place. The idea here is that just because something could be false doesn't mean that it is false, and so it doesn't mean that you don't know. Similarly, just because you aren't certain of something doesn't mean that it's not true, and so doesn't mean that you ultimately couldn't know. Think about it this way. 2 minutes after leaving your car in the parking lot, it's of course possible that your car has been struck by an asteroid and it's no longer with us. It's gone. However, that's a rather implausible situation, right? The mere possibility that could have happened means that, it's possible that your belief that your car is in the parking lot is false. But that's outlandish, right? In a way, it's an outlandish thing to claim. It's an outlandish thing to think. And so ultimately, the claim or the standard that you need to, your beliefs can't be possibly false seems like an outlandish standard to place on knowing something. Similarly with certainty. Just because you aren't certain that your car hasn't been towed or stolen or destroyed by a comet doesn't mean that you don't know. That's to put too high of a standard on knowledge. In fact, it seems that certainty should be the highest standard of knowledge. If you think about it, it seems like we know all kinds of things in our everyday lives without being certain of them. And so to say that in order to know requires you to be certain
that seems sort of backwards, right? It seems instead that maybe in order to be certain, you have to know, and then you have to know, and check, right? You have to do a lot more work to know for sure. Ultimately, these kinds of issues, you get lots of different puzzles with them too. And, so certainty as a standard of knowledge itself seems to be problematic because it can cause what we might think of as an epistemic regress. The epistemic regress being that if you're certain of something, you have to know that you know it, but then how could you possibly be certain that you are certain? And then you would have to know that you know that you know that you know, and it would be, possibly impossible to ever be certain because in order to be certain, one would have to be certain that they're certain that they're certain, and so on. Skepticism, sort of today, is still definitely around. Global skepticism, in particular in philosophical circles, is still discussed, but it's not very often that anyone takes it seriously. It seems pretty clear that we know a lot of things and that the standards for knowledge are high, but not so impossibly high. Of course, there's still skepticism that exists in particular subfields like science. Today, it's a big deal that there are lots of people that are still vaccine skeptics. But skepticism, as it stands in philosophical circles, is still good for a number of reasons. It helps us to test the limits of what we think we can know and to develop good arguments like for and against certain kinds of evidence. It helps us to test our arguments for what we believe in, and ultimately helps us to see that some people simply can't be helped. Some people are going to be skeptics no matter what can be done.